give some flavor around how there's been a market failure globally in soil carbon sequestration, and maybe a little bit of history on that would be beneficial as well. We can see your notes. So over to you, Max. Thanks.
Are you still seeing my notes, or are you just seeing the slide now?
Just seeing the slide.
Perfect. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm personally quarantined in central Connecticut. I know that we're all over the place, but I'm so glad that this event was still able to go off remotely like this. So it's great to be able to participate. As Karen said, I'm currently at Indigo AG. I'm the Director of Carbon Operations Methodology there, working on developing a couple of methodologies. But I've spent the last 11 years at the Climate Action Reserve, and most of my time in the last 4 or 5 years was spent around Grassland, first in the US and then in Canada. So I'll give a quick introduction to both organizations and then spend most of the time on content. For those not familiar with Indigo AG, we're a startup based in Boston with sort of our main headquarters in Boston and Memphis. We've got several different businesses. Carbon is growing as one of them. We also make microbial amendments for several different crops that go on seed coatings. We've got a transport business. We've got a grain marketplace business that's really focused on connecting growers who want to make low carbon or low water usage or other environmentally preferable grain, connecting them directly with buyers to sort of decommoditize in that way. But in terms of carbon, that's becoming a bigger and bigger focus. Climate Action Reserve, I think many of you at this point have heard of the Reserve, private nonprofit carbon offset project registry headquartered in Los Angeles, been around since 2001. This map will hopefully get bigger soon now that there is their first Canadian protocol, the Canadian Grassland Protocol adopted last year. And I hope to see some more green Gs popping up here. But essentially an offset project registry in the voluntary space sets these rules for how projects are to be carried out and developed and who can play, and then issues the credits. So they are the regulator in a certain sense in the voluntary market. So for most of this, I'm going to talk about different aspects of protocol development focused around grassland and soil carbon. There's a lot of different methodologies related to agriculture in one way or another, but they tend to be sort of narrow and focus on aspects of agriculture that are kind of, at least to date, have been the ones that are easier to get our hands around in terms of measurement and additionality and things like that. So, you know, livestock manure, using anaerobic digestion for dairy manure. It's a very discrete activity, almost a sort of point source of emissions. And other direct emission reduction, you know, rice cultivation has become trickier. There's been several protocols created for it, but almost no credits created through those protocols. And previous efforts around soils, such as Conservation Cropping Protocol or the Chicago Climate Exchange, there was more use of emission factors there. But the kind of holy grail that we've been trying to get to is, can we measure it? Can we get to a point where we don't have to focus so narrowly on individual practices, which either exceedingly limits the scope or just makes it really complicated to try and deal with? So there's still a lot of efforts going there. We've got some of the big issues that I'm going to talk about in here. I'll give a quick more color around voluntary and compliance protocols, a bit of discussion around the difference between a standardized protocol and a project-based protocol, and then some of the issues that tend to come up most with land-based protocols and with soil protocols around ownership, additionality, permanence, quantification, and MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. So we just started getting into this discussion a little bit, this idea between voluntary and compliance protocols. In some senses, they are completely distinct from each other. And then in other senses, it's all one market. And you're just kind of choosing your flavor of ice cream in some ways. The voluntary markets kind of came first, and they tend to inform the compliance markets. So there are certain actors who are always going to only play in the compliance market. A capped entity who has no interest in emission reductions beyond their compliance obligation is going to participate in the compliance market. And a corporation with no compliance obligations is likely to stay in the voluntary market, except they could go buy credits in the compliance market. But for those creating the credits, for a landowner, you typically have choice. So the voluntary market tends to act first and be seen as sort of a proving ground for activities and policies and approaches that can then be adopted into these regulated systems. So who develops voluntary protocols? It's usually either a carbon program itself. So Climate Action Reserve develops their own protocols with the help of expert working groups. Or some other programs like Verra, for example, it's typically external program participants. So a project developer, or there are some specialized methodology developers who, Karen's done a lot of this herself. You can create a methodology and then submit it into the program for review and approval. In some cases, for example, again, Verra, they also endorse protocols that have been adopted by other programs. So you can use CDM methodologies or reserve protocols through that program. Generally speaking, in the voluntary space, there's little kind of policy limitation on what is an acceptable project type. It's more about, what's the opportunity and can we, measure it and generate credits on it in a good way. There's not any sort of policies that say, don't touch this sector. And you'll always see a lot of involvement of expert stakeholders and public comment periods. On the compliance side, they're generally pulling ideas and protocols from the voluntary side. So in some cases, for example, the Air Resources Board in California, they took Climate Action Reserve protocols and just put them in the law verbatim. They ended up going back in a revision and putting them into legalese, but the first round, they just plopped them right in. Quebec did something a little bit similar. They looked at California's protocols and the reserve protocols and then made modifications for their first round. And then when Ontario was starting up their offset program, again, their plan was to adapt 13 protocols, not start from scratch. Now, some of those protocols started to look more like they were starting from scratch, but the general idea there was the regulators want to take what's already working and pull it into their program through the filter of their legal and regulatory language. In some cases, there are scope limitations. So the example I gave here is California's offsets program doesn't include landfill offsets because they've already got strict landfill gas regulations. So this could be a key differentiation between what's going to be available in a compliance market versus a voluntary market, is what is the regulator already regulating. And I'm also happy to take questions as we go. So that may be easiest if people are typing in the chat, and Karen, you're welcome to interrupt me. That might be the easiest way to do it.
Okay.
Now this next level, standardized versus project-based, this one's a little bit wonkier. When the carbon market started out, you saw more project-based protocols. So the CDM kind of works this way where it's bottom up and you create a methodology that basically allows a little bit more variability between projects of the same type, and it puts more of the burden on the project and the project developer to show how they are additional and how they are going to quantify things. And so the methodologies are more of a framework, and they're not quite as prescriptive and sort of top down. There's more subjectivity, so there's more need for kind of interpretation and judgment. There's often a step called validation where there's this layer of checking, is the methodology being applied correctly before you even get into verifying the actual results. But it provides a bit more flexibility for kind of new project ideas where it might be harder to standardize it across a whole sector. So standardized protocol, this is the way the reserve works, and this is where you're seeing compliance protocols moving in this direction because it's more similar to the way the regulators are used to regulating things. Typically more narrow in scope, much more prescriptive guidance. So again, you can avoid this need for project validation by having essentially a protocol that already validates a certain activity in a certain sector. So it reduces that burden on the project developer, but it increases the burden on the protocol developer. More work goes into creating a standardized protocol because there tends to have to be more analysis and more creation of that prescriptive guidance so that everybody's playing by the same rules. In theory, this is more easily applied to a large number of individual projects because you hopefully lower the barriers to actual project development. They also tend to be more objective, which is a blessing and a curse. So strict, prescriptive, objective requirements can tend to throw up false positives and false negatives. So some people get excluded because they don't have the opportunity to do their project-based rationale, and other people maybe get included who wouldn't have gotten through the project-based. So there's trade-offs to both, but we're seeing more use of standardized protocols. So some of the challenges I wanted to highlight up front with soil carbon, put these into 3 different buckets. We've got policy challenges, so establishing additionality for agricultural practices, and I'll get a little bit deeper into additionality, but figuring out what's going above and beyond business as usual can be really tricky in land use and in agricultural management. These are things that are changing. They're things where people might try something and then abandon it. Management might change based on weather, they change based on market forces. So it is really not the same as an industrial emitter who either does or does not have a scrubber on their stack. In the industrial projects, it tends to be much more straightforward, or things like energy production. Ensuring permanence is another policy challenge. It's a practical challenge, but it's also a policy challenge. How do we put in place rules that are going to ensure that the carbon being stored in the soil is fungible with the emission from the factory or from the airline? And then aggregating projects at scale. This is kind of a programmatic issue as programs evolve and try new things, trying to create frameworks where you don't want the program's rules to be the one thing holding the market back, right? You want to create a way that you can have project developers create projects at scale, but also have buyers be comfortable with the way the credits are being created. My second bucket is scientific challenges. So data is a big problem with soil carbon. It doesn't matter how much data you've got, you've never got enough. So we don't have sufficient data across time and space. So we need data from a variety of landscapes, and we need that data over time. We need to be able to understand the different biogeochemical processes that are going on to support project level quantification. So that's an important consideration here. We've got some pretty great tools for national level quantification and regional quantification. But getting down to a project level where we're going to issue a credit to an individual landowner is a different ballgame. And then calibrating and validating models. So having models that can be used across different landscapes and for different activities is a challenge. The technical challenges, soil sampling. So this comes back to the scientific challenges. It's expensive and time consuming and labor intensive to get those soil samples and get them tested and get all those data, and then actually using and verifying the models. So not only do you have to have the data and create a model and validate that model, but then it's no easy feat to actually use those models in a project context and have them verified. So these are barriers that are being put in place against soil carbon projects. So let's drill down now in some of the individual areas. And again, if any questions pop up, feel free to interrupt. So additionality is everybody's favorite. I've never heard anybody say they don't like additionality. Credited emission reductions must go above and beyond business as usual. So that there's a lot right there. business as usual what? So you have to be able to define what is business as usual. I've laid out a few different boxes here of ways to try and define additionality. These can be used together. These can be used in a project-based way. These can be used in a standardized way. So they're not mutually exclusive. One that's very common, financial analysis. This is very intuitive. People think, well, if they need the money from the offsets to do the thing, then you should pay them to do the thing. So in that case, you're trying to show that your baseline scenario, what would have happened in the absence of the project, would be more profitable than the project scenario, what you're trying to get paid to do. So I'll use the example of grassland conservation here. The baseline scenario is that the grassland would be converted into cropland. And the project scenario is that you're actually going to keep it as grassland. So if you're doing a financial analysis at the project level in this, rather than a standardized threshold, but a project-based financial analysis, that's actually can be pretty labor intensive. And it can be pretty subjective. So you're putting a lot of faith in the project developer to come up with this financial analysis with all these assumptions of here's how much money we would make doing this, and here's how much money we're going to make doing this. So at a project-based financial additionality test can be really fraught and a lot of work. A standardized financial additionality test can work more smoothly. Again, it can be a blunt instrument, but I'll talk a little bit later about how that actually works in the Grassland protocol. Another way to try and get at additionality, barriers analysis. So financial could be seen as one barrier. Another way of getting at barriers analysis is social, cultural, technological barriers. So it could be that there's a certain technology you need to do the project, and the offsets, in some cases, maybe it's a big project with lots of small participants, and it's that big project developer coming in who's actually enabling this technology and enabling these people to do the activity. So in that case, there's a barrier. In terms of cropland management, quite a bit, there are cultural and social barriers, just getting farmers to change their behavior. So it might make long-term financial sense to adopt certain ag practices, but still they don't get adopted because that's not the way farming is done, and nobody wants to be the first one to adopt it and have their neighbors, you know, whisper about them at the coffee shop. Again, a project level barriers analysis can be very subjective and time consuming. So essentially the same cons as project level financial analysis. The pro here with barriers analysis is it can be flexible. And this is something that is regularly used in the standardized approach, where you're looking across a sector and you're saying what's holding this project activity back in this sector. So you might be able to layer these together in certain ways. A more common approach for a standardized methodology is this common practice threshold. So here you look at the project activity or the technology that the project is putting in place, and you assess the market penetration of that activity. So for example, with livestock manure digesters, when the reserves protocol for that one was developed in 2007, I think it was based on the market penetration rate of anaerobic digestion in the dairy industry in the US, and it was less than 1% at that time. So they simply said, it's additional. If you are a dairy who uses open manure lagoons, it's not common practice for you to replace that lagoon with an anaerobic digester. So it's very simple. It's very top-down. It required somebody to do an upfront analysis. Luckily, the government was tracking these data already. And it allows you to just draw a line in the sand and you're set. It's objective. You're in or you're out. Typically, you see this threshold of what is common practice being set at 5%. I believe that's actually in the VCS standard. The reserve doesn't have a published standard for what is common practice, so it can be more flexible. But you're looking for an exceedingly low business as usual. So right there is a con if you have maybe something that appears to have a higher market penetration, 30, 40%, but perhaps adoption of that practice has stalled out. People aren't taking it up. Or perhaps you need to drill down and say, well, that 30 or 40% of this sector that's already doing that thing, they're unique because of X, Y, or Z. So maybe that's where you combine it with barriers analysis, where you say, well, there's a barrier to all these other people to actually doing this. So there's ways, again, to hybridize a little bit. It can be resource intensive. It can be something that needs to be updated over time. Now, you wouldn't update it to reflect market penetration that's necessarily because of offsets. So you could still look at what is the market penetration of people doing this without the incentive from offsets. But you're still always going to get, again, false positives and false negatives. So false positive is somebody that gets into the program that wasn't truly additional. And a false negative is somebody that doesn't get into the program even though they were truly additional. And it's always a balance between those. Another one I put here, on which I am not an expert, but Karen is proportional additionality. So this is another way of kind of taking that market penetration assessment and using it in a different way. So instead of drawing a line and you're either in or out based on that market penetration, perhaps the activity is still additional, but there is some discount on everybody's crediting based on the existing market penetration. So my understanding is that's been applied for conservation cropping and that it is a target that gets updated over time. So still, pro here, it's still objective. You can apply it in a very straightforward way and it's easy to verify. In this case, you're also providing an additional bit of reward for early actors to continue doing what they're doing. Whereas typically under these other additionality approaches, somebody who's already doing the thing is not going to get in the program at all.
And Max, if I may just interject.
Yes, go right ahead.
This proportional additionality typically applies to sinks where you have the dual objective of let's maintain the sink built to date, but keep building the sink going forward.
Great. That is a good distinction. I think it's an important distinction for people to keep in mind generally through this whole presentation is that we might treat emission reductions and sequestration differently. Okay. So I'll give the examples of how additionality works in the two Grassland protocols that I've worked on. So on the Reserves Canada Grassland protocol, it is a standardized approach and it's got a couple of levels. One is this financial analysis and the other is what I'm calling a reverse barriers analysis. So financial analysis, top-down threshold, and so the threshold itself is set by the protocol. So you don't have to provide an argument of like, here's the ROI that I would need to do this project activity. The protocol sets a threshold. It's between 40 and 100% is a sort of gray area, and then 100% and above is you're in, and you do a real estate appraisal. This is where it becomes project specific. You're actually doing a real estate appraisal of your project area. So we just didn't have standardized national data to completely carry this through as a standardized threshold. So there is still a project specific component. This barriers analysis, what I'm calling a reverse barriers analysis, is showing not that, that there's a barrier to the project activity, but that there's not a barrier to the baseline activity. So you're showing that the site is actually suitable for crop cultivation. Use the land suitability rating system. This one is a completely standardized threshold. The protocol says you look at the land suitability rating of your project area for crop cultivation and you got to hit this certain rating. By putting them together, you then have this kind of hybrid approach. In the US, it's essentially the same approach but with different data plugged in to apply them. So that financial analysis, there is a default standardized way to do it because they've got county level rental rate data. So in that case, comparing cropland rental rate data and pasture land rental rate data across the country at the county level. And that has to hit a certain threshold. And then the site suitability, same thing. The land capability classification system, very similar to LSRS. Any questions on additionality before I dive into another topic?
Hi, Max. This is Denise.
Mm-hmm.
This seems to be an area where, between this and reversibility, this seems to be an area of grave concern by those either who are, the regulators trying to assess protocols for compliance uses, or just people understanding whether these are real projects or, as some call them, hot air. And without having to get into the details of a protocol, how do you respond to people who ask, is this a real project? They might not understand the details of additionality in the way that you've presented it. How do you respond to some of these concerns, generally, or for the regulator, I guess, in more detail?
Sure. And I would say that it's, my experience is that it's been trickier to respond to those concerns from the perspective of a standardized approach to additionality than a project-based approach, even though I feel like on the whole it's easier to poke holes in individual projects through the project-based approach. I think intuitively people feel like if the individual project has to prove themselves, that it's more real. But I think if we step back and look at the whole market, I don't think that that's necessarily true, and I think it excludes a lot of people. I think, again, it takes this sort of overall view of the market, and you try to develop these standards in a way that's as open and inclusive and defensible as possible. So the use of expert working groups and a working group process that is open to the public and open to scrutiny allows, I think, a bit more confidence in the outcome. Especially here with these Grassland protocols, these are completely counterfactual, right? Avoided conversion. So it's even trickier. And there's no, I would say there's no kind of Band-Aid answer that says this is good because of this. Carbon offsets are an intangible good. And so there's a bit of sort of faith in the product and the concept of the carbon offset. And I think if somebody digs into it and follows the process, they can see that emissions are being reduced, and they're being reduced in a real and rigorous manner. But it's always going to be complex for sure.
So I see. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
okay. Yeah, and Denise, and what we've indicated in the protocol is we've customized it to Canada, that we've talked about the eco-gift program that have certified appraisers, and we've interacted with some of the certified appraisers, and they bring their appraisal to a panel of others that go through it and identify whether the value of the land in a cow-calf, ranching operation versus the value of the land in an annual cropping system. That's all kind of peer reviewed, and the eco-gift program is a national program that Canada has, and we think that that's probably one of the ones that makes the most sense to rely on.
Mm-hmm. Specifically with Grassland as well, the project activity is this long-term commitment to conservation. So there is something new that occurs and triggers the ability to generate credits. So we think that also ties in very tightly.
Thank you.
Max, there's a question online.
Mm-hmm.
Would the financial analysis include conversions to other uses, i.e. development or recreation, or is it just the value of the lands as if it was under agricultural use or farmed?
No, it is just farmland. So this comes back to sort of technical and scientific reasons. The quantification itself is based on the conversion of that grassland to annual cropland. So we had the same issue in the US when we were modeling the emission factors. Here is that we didn't have data to support emission factors for going from grassland to developed land or something like that. So at the moment, no, it's only comparing those scenarios. So it does mean you might have grassland in areas where actually development pressure is the highest pressure. And then it's a question of, is there also financial pressure to convert it to cropland? Like, could you still make that financial argument? And if not, maybe it's just not eligible. As I got back, sort of ties back to the beginning, where protocols are often narrow in scope.
Another question online, Max.
Mm-hmm.
Let me read it. Oh, I don't have my glasses on. How does the Canada Protocol provide a sense of the actual risk of conversion of a specific plot of land, similar to how county level rental rates data can provide a proxy of financial pressure for conversions in US counties?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the real estate appraisal. So as you were saying, you do that appraisal for both land use values and compare them. The shorthand within the methodologies is assuming that cropland is more valuable than pasture land, that difference between them is the cropland premium. And so the threshold is, how big does your cropland premium have to be?
Right, and the land suitability rating is usually class 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's got to be land that's suitable for annual cropping.
Yep. All right, maybe I'll jump into ownership. This isn't quite as hairy a topic as additionality, but it does come up quite a bit, is, who gets the credits in projects like these, especially land-based projects. In the reserve protocols, they use the term project owner, and that's the entity who owns the rights to the greenhouse gas emission reductions. Identifying this owner depends on the nature of what you're crediting for. So if you're just crediting emission reductions, then it's pretty straightforward. You focus on the operator of the activity. So if you are reducing emissions at a factory, it's the person who operates the factory. If you're talking about stored or sequestered carbon, then it can be more complex. You generally are going to need to involve the landowner, and if there's a conservation easement involved in the project, the easement holder. The example here in forestry, the project owner is whoever owns the rights to the timber, which is almost always the landowner, but not always. And so you'll see, like in the US, all these forest projects going into the California compliance program, the actual forest owner is the account holder in the registry. In the grassland protocols, it allows for decoupling that land ownership from the rights to the greenhouse gas emission reductions. This is partly due to the fact that when you've got that conservation easement in place, it does introduce some uncertainty. Most easements traditionally don't address carbon at all, right? But you've given the development rights essentially away to that, or sold them to that easement holder. So it's not clear who owns the rights for the conservation of that land for the emission reductions itself. So in that case, what the approach that the reserve took was that, look, anybody can own the rights to the emission reductions, but whoever it is, both the landowner and the easement holder have to be signed on to some legal contract agreeing to it. So maybe the landowner retains those rights and the easement holder doesn't take them. You've got projects where that was the case. And in that case, the easement holder submitted a signed letter to the registry attesting that they don't take any of the carbon rights along with their easement. You can also see the opposite. The easement actually transfers the carbon rights from the landowner to the easement holder. You could also have a third party. Both could sign on to a contract that transfers these rights to a carbon project developer. My last point here is about purchase contracts. So this has also been something that's come up a lot in my time in the market, is that sometimes these forward credit sales contracts where somebody will sign a contract with a project developer to buy their credits can be written in as a way that makes it seem like the purchaser is actually the owner of the greenhouse gas rights. And so it's just important from the registry perspective that that contract does not convey ownership prior to credit issuance, because the registry needs to know who is the owner of the rights on the land and issue the credits to that entity. They don't care who you sell them to after that. but that's an important thing to keep in mind when thinking about these sales contracts. Ownership also ties, I think, together pretty well with aggregation, so I like to put them together.
Hey, Matt,
aggregation.
We have another question.
Yeah.
From Glenn. Re-carbon ownership, do you have experience on what's happened where the landowner is the government? Ooh.
That's a great question. It depends on which government. So essentially, at least in the US, the land-based protocols exclude federal projects on federal lands. And that's partly because of the federal government not really putting their foot down about carbon rights and carbon ownership. And some questions about additionality in terms of the way those lands are going to be managed and whether they're actually at the same threat as private lands. There are carbon projects on state-owned lands in certain cases or municipally owned lands. Another example from the US is that as the railroads went west, every county they passed through, they gave a portion of that land to the states, and the states hold millions of acres in trust to support their public education systems. And that includes millions of acres of grassland, which can be leased out for crop cultivation. So there were a lot of discussions in certain Midwestern and Western states around the state itself becoming a project developer by putting conservation easements on these trust lands and using them for carbon instead of allowing them to be leased out. Tribal lands are similarly complicated because there's weird tie-ins with the federal government. I believe in the Canada Protocol, we are excluding crown lands. And I don't know what else it says about it. Karen could probably fill in there.
Yeah, we're in the midst of looking at all of that information right now, because there's all sorts of classifications of lands, and there is some precedent on our First Nations lands as well with the conservation cropping protocols. So we've been pulling that stuff into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, several tribes in the U.S. have been doing large forest projects. So it's always, the registry always tries to encourage that wherever possible. Great question. So aggregation. Aggregation is the idea of tying multiple projects together for economies of scale. So there's a lot of fixed costs in project development, verification being a really big one, where verifying a big project costs more than a small project, but not in direct proportion to their size. So it's still expensive to verify small projects. So if you can group them together and verify them together, then you can get some economies of scale. I've broken out two different ways to think about aggregation, and these are applied differently in different places. We see less aggregation in the Western Climate Initiative compliance programs. There's more tied to individual projects. But I think especially for land-based and for especially small landowners to be able to participate, it's absolutely key. So the first level here is what I'm calling administrative aggregation. The reserve uses the word cooperatives in the grassland protocols for this. And this was something that in working with Ontario and Quebec, they were really interested in pushing this type of aggregation, where you still have separate projects. Each property is still its own project and has their own documentation and their own serial numbers in the registry, and they may have different ownership, but they can be managed as a group. So it's sort of like collective bargaining. You can hire one verifier to do one verification activity. You don't get all the economies, but you get hopefully some economies. The next level, the deeper level of aggregation, sort of grouped projects, is where you have a single project that comprises multiple properties in different places with different characteristics. In this case, you need to have a single point of ownership of those greenhouse gas rights. So if you were to do this on grassland projects, the protocol doesn't currently allow it, but it could, and you would need that third party essentially to get all the carbon rights. It should reduce cost and complexity, but But one downside of this kind of deeper level of aggregation is maybe some reduced clarity for the buyers and the regulators. So I know that, you know, California Air Resources Board has been hesitant to go here because they want each serialized credit to be traced back to one, you know, one property, one landowner, rather than having the credit traced into a pool of landowners and not knowing exactly which property it came from. But I do think they're getting a little bit more comfortable with that. You need this level of grouping to really reach economies of scale for certain project types. Another hairy topic. So permanence comes up anytime you're trying to store carbon somewhere. That could be in a tree, that could be in your grassland, that could be in an underground salt mine full of CO2 that you've pumped in there. Stored carbon has to be permanent in order to be fungible in the marketplace. So your buyer on one side, they're going to put a ton of carbon up into the atmosphere, and that ton of carbon is going to be there for a super long time. So it's not 1 ton for 1 year. That same ton is there for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So the international community has said, look, 100 years is long enough to call forever, even though that ton of carbon is still there. It's still sort of working its way down. So any premature release of stored carbon is a reversal of that. This is addressed in different ways in different programs, but it is something that's typically going to be required for any high quality carbon offset. So compliance offset programs are going to require permanence. I mentioned here ICAO's CORSIA program, super long acronyms. So we got the International Civil Aviation Organization Compliance Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. It's essentially a compliance program, but they're not creating their own program in the same way as other compliance programs. They're going to be pulling from existing voluntary and compliance programs. So programs like the Reserve and Vera are applying and being approved to generate credits for the CORSIA market. So this is really exciting for something like the Grassland protocol, because it's already approved by the Climate Action Reserve, and the Climate Action Reserve has been approved by ICAO. And so now it's a way for those what were voluntary credits to flow into a new compliance market. It's going to be a big demand. It's international flights between participating countries, but there's also, they've approved 6 different programs. So there's going to be a lot of supply. But I think this is where differentiators and co-benefits are going to be important.
Yeah, Matt, maybe I'll jump in right here.
Sure.
Because I don't know if this community is so aware of this. So Katie presented sort of the Paris Accord and countries submitting NDCs. Well, international airlines are between countries, and there was no mechanism for them to be brought into a compliance program. So that's why the international airline industry stepped up to build this program. I dare say we're probably going to see the International Marine Federation as well get engaged in this. And so there's going to be more demand out there beyond our traditional thinking of you know, corporations and regulated markets within countries.
Yep. And they've set extremely strict emission unit criteria, they call it. So love it or hate it, permanence is being baked into the high quality programs. So there's different ways we can handle this. When it comes to forestry, asking certain forest landowners to maintain a pool of carbon for 100 years is not a huge lift. That's a community that often has that long-term view. But in terms of other lands, and especially agricultural lands, it can be trickier. Now, with grassland, in some ways it was still somewhat straightforward. We can use conservation easements, and we can move the land into, again, a community with a long-term view of stewardship and kind of maintenance of that carbon pool. Cropland is much trickier in the middle there because it's actively managed, and that management is changing over time. So what are the ways that we deal with it? First is accounting of that reversal risk. What are the ways that the carbon could be released over time, and then keeping a percentage of credits based on that risk in a buffer pool, so that if you see a reversal happen, you've got a shared insurance pool that can pay out essentially by retiring credits from that pool and cover that risk. This is a good approach that can work, especially for unavoidable or catastrophic reversals, natural events, things like that, where you can estimate the risk over time. The use of a conservation easements, as I mentioned. Now you've got a legal mechanism that's protecting the land in perpetuity. You've got somebody who's actually monitoring it and has the ability to kind of enforce their easement over time. Conservation organizations themselves are long-lived and have resources into the future to protect the land. So I think that's a really, really useful tool when it comes to grassland. Legal contracts are a tool. So the reserve uses something called the Project Implementation Agreement. This is where the project owner of the emission reductions, before they receive those reductions, agrees to monitor and protect the carbon for a certain length of time. Right now, the PIA is 100 years from issuance. So the project owner is actually signing up to monitor and protect the carbon for 100 years. In regulatory programs, you may not need that tool because you've got a regulator with enforcement capabilities. So again, California hasn't felt the need for the legal contract because they are a government body and they can enforce their program. And then the last bullet here, ton-year accounting, is the super wonky approach to not having to deal with permanence by essentially giving you fewer credits. And so instead of getting 100 tons today, you get 1 ton today. Next year you get another one. The year after that you get another one. So it spreads that crediting out over the actual atmospheric benefit, the actual effect on radiative forcing of that carbon removal. So ton-year accounting can also be kind of draconian in terms of having to wait so long for your credits. In the Reserve's Mexico Forest Protocol, those projects make a 20-year commitment, so they get 20% of their credits. And then each year they re-up their 20-year commitment. And so that's that sort of hybrid version of ton-year accounting. That is built in as an option in the Canada Grassland Protocol. So if you essentially sign a PIA for a shorter period, like 20 years, then you get in this ton-year accounting schedule and you maintain permanence during that 20 years, but then you're off the hook after the 20 years. If you want to get more credits, then you would either re-up or just stick with it. There's one other approach that the Reserve is now considering through the Soil Enrichment Protocol, which being currently developed. I'll talk more about that protocol at the end. That's what I'm working on these days. Still considering reversal risk for 100 years, but allowing a PIA to be signed for shorter than 100 years, but not requiring the use of ton-year accounting. So essentially, it says, you know, if you only sign a 30-year contract, then before that 30-year contract ends, you either have to extend it or you have to receive approval for some alternative mechanism to either demonstrate that the risk of avoidable reversals is now acceptably low. So in the grassland context, you know, if the Reserve decided to put this into that protocol, that could be something like demonstrating success through monitoring and enforcing of the easement or something like that. The other option here for an alternative mechanism to let the project owner step away would be implementation of some remote system for monitoring, identification, and compensation of reversals. So what would that look like? If you were able to tap into a remote sensing system that could detect any changes to the land use, that would actually identify it as a reversal. So if they could detect tillage or conversion of the land to development or something like that, and identify that, and then you also paired that with something like a surety bond that would pay out in the event that that a reversal occurred, or an insurance contract or something like that. So these are just ideas essentially, and you need to develop something and have the Reserve approve it before your PIA runs out. And the third option here is if you do nothing and you only sign a 30-year PIA, then at the end of that 30 years, then you have a reversal for the remainder of your reversible emission reductions. One thing to keep in mind ties back to this ton-year accounting idea is the actual reversal magnitude also goes down over time. So 100 tons stored today, and you need to maintain them for 100 years. After 50 years, you've achieved 50% of that atmospheric benefit. So if you have a complete reversal after 50 years, it's only 50% reversal. It's not 100%. So the actual magnitude, the actual impact of any reversal is going down over time. So this will allow shorter term contracts, but also provides time for us to develop better solutions. I think we're seeing that remote capabilities and the data coming out of satellite data are going to make these kinds of things a lot easier in the future. We're just not fully there yet. Okay, this is a fun one. We're going to get into quantification. So I've laid out here in the rows some different ways of quantifying soil carbon. And in the columns, some of the sort of ways that we would consider these different mechanisms. So the top row here, you could use default factors. I talked about this at the top of the presentation. There are some approaches just using national level default factors or even regional level default factors. Obviously low cost, accuracy for any given project is going to be low, and the uncertainty is going to be high because you don't know that your total regional averages are really right for that field. But very easy to use, low project data needs, but you need high sector data. So you need a lot of data, across time and space to be able to generate good factors. The next level up in terms of a little bit higher cost, but a little bit higher accuracy is pre-modeled default factors. So this is what's used in both of the Grassland protocols right now, where because they're counterfactual, you don't actually know what the cropland activity would have been on the project area. It is very reasonable to use these kind of uncertain assumptions about what the conversion activity would have been. So it's a very reasonable, I say high uncertainty because you don't actually know what the cropping activity is going to be, but this is actually a very reasonable time to apply something like that because again, it didn't actually get converted to cropland. So higher, a little bit higher cost because you have to spend a lot of money during protocol development to develop these factors, but very easy to use for the project itself. Accuracy I call as medium because it is going to be much more accurate than these sort of national level factors, but it's maybe not going to be as accurate for the field as doing something more field specific. You do still, again, need data. So as I mentioned, the emission factors in the Grassland protocols are just for cropland conversion. Then we get into these sort of project level ways of quantification. Directly measuring the soil, you've got higher cost, higher accuracy, you still got some uncertainty, it becomes much more difficult to do, and you start to need more data from your project, and then sector data needs is more about how do you translate the soil cores you're getting into the total area of the project. Project level modeling, and then the hybrid modeling and measurement. So modeling, again, you've got to have biogeochemical models that work for the landscape and for the activities that you're doing in your region. And then this hybrid is potentially better. It's still going to be high cost, but you can combine the use of direct measurements with some modeling and potentially get to a more accurate place over time. This is all to say there's different ways to come at this, and each one, I think, has its appropriate use. But these are all the things that would have to be considered in development of any given protocol about what's going to be appropriate to be used in that protocol. When we talk about the actual monitoring, reporting, verification on the project, again, it's a balancing act. You could have really, really rigorous data collection and reporting and verification, and it's too costly. So you got to balance that with being flexible about what data people have and what they can get, but still be rigorous. The level of monitoring also depends on that quantification approach. So you know, looking back here, project data needs are pretty low if you've got default factors, either at a regional or pre-modeled for your project activity. Your data needs from your project go higher when you're actually trying to quantify, model the things happening on your project. So you're making a trade-off. You're maybe going to get more credits by modeling your specific project, but maybe it's going to cost you more to get those credits. When we're talking about grassland, we're always going to need to know something about grazing. So just wanted to make sure people keep that in mind. The timelines for reporting and verification are going to depend a little bit on the program. Typically, compliance programs, you're going to see reporting every year. So that's a cost that's going to come through every year. The voluntary programs may be more relaxed. So the reserve allows you to wait several years and verify several years at a time. You're still collecting data in each of those years, and you're still sort of filling out reports in the interim years. You can spread out that verification cost. So that's where they can maybe be a little bit more flexible. And then in general, the monitoring requirements are going to change when you leave that crediting period and enter just the permanence period. So, for example, under Vera, permanence is still based on a 100-year timeline, but you don't actually have obligations after the crediting period. At that point, the registry itself is sort of on the hook using the buffer pool. At the reserve, they require that 100 years of monitoring following credit issuance. But for grassland projects, it's at a much reduced intensity and typically tries to piggyback on the monitoring that's already happening for the conservation easement. Talk quickly about the experience so far with the grassland protocol in the US. Give you a sense of who's participating. So we've got 2 large conservation organizations, Ducks Unlimited with 1 project, TNC with 5. I think these are actually individual different state chapters of the TNC. So they're kind of a unique organization in that way. Small conservation organizations, the Southern Plains Land Trust is doing 4 projects, and then a couple of private landowners are participating. And this is where they are located. So the Southern Plains Land Trust makes up most of the Colorado projects, along with Ducks Unlimited. These were the first in the program, and they've generated about 49,000 tons. A CRT is a climate reserve ton. Montana, this is where there's a couple of the private landowners are here in Montana, and then TNC is the one most active here in Oregon, doing several projects together. So in all, 102,000 CRTs issued. The first version was adopted in 2015, first credits issued 2016. And then just a quick overview of what I'm working on right now. Indigo Ag is running soil carbon protocols through both the reserve and Vera. So the reserve protocol, the soil enrichment protocol that they're working on is just for the US, but the Vera methodology is global, and both of them are targeted for adoption this summer. I would say for the avoided conversion, the existing grassland protocol is still much easier to use and is going to be the way to go. The goal here is a much more sort of flexible, broad scope agricultural land management approach, mixing direct measurement of soil carbon along with modeling of soil carbon changes and nitrous oxide and methane emissions. So, you know, a lot of the stuff I talked about at the beginning about how much more complicated it can get if you're trying to use a wide scope. This one's going to be complicated, unfortunately. But the goal here is to make it very flexible so that people can get better with their methods and their models over time. Just to show you the quick timeline, they're both kind of getting close to public comment in the next month or so, and then expected adoption here in the summer. So anybody interested in that can look out for those announcements through both registries. And those are my remarks.
All right. Well, Max, that was a pretty good overview, I'd say. One of the things I think we're interested in is the discussions that the reserve has had with ARB around their comfort level with this particular protocol. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. That was something that I put a lot of time into a couple of years ago under one of the USDA Conservation Innovation Grants. And we went and had some meetings with ARB. I'd say there is a lot of interest and pressure from outside of ARB for them to adopt protocols that include more ag and more land-based activities. So the actual staff, I think, are hesitant because it's complicated. It's hard to enforce. You know, forestry is a headache for them, although it generates millions of tons, so they'll take it. So I think there's a lot of stakeholder interest. I think the things that they've been concerned about, I mentioned that they've been concerned about aggregation in the past. So that was where that idea of cooperatives came from. Instead of deeply aggregating into grouped projects, cooperatives was designed as something palatable to a regulator, this kind of administrative aggregation. Permanence is one that they're concerned about. I think despite, you know, when developing that protocol, the working group talked a lot about the fact that there's essentially very low risk of sort of natural disturbance of the soil carbon. And so in putting together those reversal risk ratings for the buffer pool, they're pretty low. And that the main risks are related to humans and changing, you know, starting to till the land or, you know, build parking lots or whatever. So ARB was concerned about climate change, reversing the carbon that had already been credited. The experts we spoke to said that's not a big concern, especially since the quantification is already so conservative under the grassland protocols. It's only in the top 30 centimeters. So there's carbon being protected below those 30 centimeters that's not been credited for. So that was a concern of theirs. Otherwise, you know, it seems like it should be a home run for them. It's a pretty straightforward project type. The emission factors have already been created, so they're not running complex models at the project level, and it's very stable year over year. Once you've got those conservation easements in place, it's a very stable project with very stable quantification and reporting. So I think it should be attractive to them. If folks haven't been keeping up on the process, they've formed an offset protocol task force in California that is now meeting to make recommendations to ARB about where they should go next. And it includes basically representatives from different stakeholder segments. And there's at least one stakeholder, Robert Parkhurst, who was deeply involved in the Grassland protocol and in ag offset protocols over time, who is on that working group. And so I hope Robert is doing his part to promote the uptake of this protocol. It was designed with ARB in mind from the ground up.
Max, there's a question online here. Is there a concern over double accounting, and how is it being managed in projects in light of the different systems being developed?
Sure, double counting, boy, that's a fun one. There's all kinds of ways double counting can occur, and the registries put a lot of protections in place. And that's one thing that that ICAO dug really deeply into with CORSIA, because they're an international program, and double counting becomes doubly important when you're thinking about potential international transfers of credits. But I'll give you some basics. Number one is the project area itself, you know, within the registry is tracked very closely. So you can't have it double counted within the registry. The registries check with each other before they issue credits to projects to make sure that there's not another project in that registry that's issuing that. So there's these sort of programmatic and administrative issues. There's a more policy issue before you even develop a protocol, that you would only target sectors where you can be sure that the emission reduction you're crediting is not going to be credited somewhere else. So one example I would give is that for landfill gas, the offset quantification ends at the point that the methane is destroyed. Even if you generate renewable electricity with that methane, you don't get credit for it in your offsets, because you might get credit for it in your renewable electricity program. So those accounting boundaries stop. In the case of low carbon fuels, that was a point where you have to actually choose between offsets or low carbon fuels for something like a manure digester because the accounting boundaries overlap. So you couldn't get both because it'd be double counting. There's places, what's called credit or payment stacking, where you might be getting payments on the land that are related to the project activity, but not related to the carbon. Those tend to get assessed by the registry on a case-by-case basis. So an example is if you got a grant that helped you fund the project, that's not a problem. But if that grant was actually tied to specific tons of carbon and the grantor was making carbon claims based on that, then maybe you do have a double counting problem and you have to address it. In the registry system itself, anytime a credit is retired, that is public, and you see who retired it. So the information is there. There's a certain point that's outside of control of the registries where an unscrupulous offset owner could sell their credits to multiple people and just not tell them the serial numbers or whatever and allow other people to make claims. There's not really anything the registry system can do about that. But in the compliance systems, they are tracked at the serial number level and they get surrendered and retired by the administrator. So anybody who's concerned about double counting, who's buying offsets, should only go through a system with a certain level of transparency so they can see what's going on and be assured that, that their credits are only being retired for them. On the international level, there's way more to it, and I won't go into it.
Graham, if I may, and this might actually be a better question for you, Graham, given all of your past history at the Farmers Advocate Office and the early and mid years of Alberta's carbon market. Manitoba, there's Manitoba people listening in and wondering why Crown land would be excluded.
Oh, well, specifically dealing with the conservation cropping protocol, there were two pieces that were in there. One is the Crown at the time wanted some inventory of where they had the offset developed, and so part of that was a landowner agreement as one of the policy tools the government at the time checked on that the offset was being built in Alberta. They've got a different system now. Every year, all of the aggregators have to throw into a database where all the projects are, and any farmer bringing new lands has to get those lands into the database. But the second piece, though, was in how the protocol was designed. So the conservation cropping protocol had two parts. There was a greenhouse gas reduction and a soil sink. And at that particular time, legislation outlined that the sink right was a property right. So the protocol was designed at that time around both sets of owners. The owner that reduced his greenhouse gas or reduction by switching to no-till, and that was the farmer piece. But then the landowner owning of the surface right also had to transact on the process. So long story short, then when you were integrating into lands that were Crown, annual cropping land that had renters on it, and the landowner was public lands at the time, there was sign off. The owner, representing the district manager, did sign off and agreed to be a part of the offset market. So the regional manager participated just like any other landowner. On other pieces, it's really a policy question whether or not the owner of the land want to participate. And at that particular time, the policy was no, they weren't going to participate. That still may be up in the case, and then the other folks may know better in today's policy environment. And then for the purposes of Crown land in relationship to our folks that are on reserve land, it's the case that the land was held in trust by the federal ministry. So all the parties dealing with the land that specifically inside the reserve all had to sign off. So it's not necessarily a case of they don't want to participate, just that those folks have to go through the process of getting all of the signatures required so you could have that contract having all the players, including all the different landowners that would be involved, and if the landowners are crowned, you know, the duly represented sign off from a signing officer so they can participate.
Thanks,
Just
Graham. And
long-winded answer.
No, it's okay. These are hard things to solve, and they are a policy issue, and it will change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Back in the day when Max and I were, you know, working with the ministries of Ontario and Quebec, there was a lot of discussion around the forest carbon on Crown lands, and would they free that carbon up in forestry protocols? And historically, we have had those conversations in Alberta as well. And as we move forward with maybe a new attempt at forestry protocols, we're going to have those conversations. So it's sometimes a ministry by ministry discussion, and it is definitely a policy issue.
Agreed.
Any color to add, Max, or anybody else? Feel free to add some comments.
Nothing more from me. You guys covered it well.
Max, thank you very much. Any other questions for Max? I know we have question period a little later on, but any burning questions for Max?
This is Amanda from Alberta Environment and Parks.
Amanda, can you get a little closer to your mic? You're a little muffled.
Is this any better?
A little bit. Sorry.
So I think it was in November 2018 that I was in an event in Calgary with a lot of the folks who are in the room right now. And in that conversation, there was a lot of conversation. This is related to my earlier question on additionality. There was a lot of conversation in the room about how Canada doesn't have a similar data source to be able to prove additionality as is available in the United States with those county rental rates. And the discussion that we got into for some time in that November 2018 event was that the information that's available in the States is very helpful because those rental rates give a more area-specific view of the actual risk of a piece of land being reversed. But simply using real estate appraisals in Canada would give an idea of the value, but doesn't go far enough to prove that that piece of land actually was at risk of a reversal. Since that conversation, has there been any changes made in the methodology of the Canada Protocol, or anything added to the additionality methods to be able to demonstrate that additionality in that baseline?
Max, can you kind of paraphrase Amanda's question? She was a little broken.
Sure. As I understand it, she's highlighting the difference between the U.S. Financial additionality test, which is able to leverage these national data sets, and the Canada Protocol financial additionality test, which relies only on the site-specific real estate appraisal. And the question of, has anything changed since that was laid out at the CFGA event in Calgary in 2018? And the short answer is no. That is where the protocol ended up and was published with that approach. You know, from the registry's perspective, the county level rental rate data is a much more practical test, but conceptually gets you the same thing as the real estate appraisal. It's more objective. So it would be nice if we had a more objective view of it, but the real estate appraisal the main downside we see of it is that it's costly and can be subjective. But that's the way the forest avoided conversion protocol works. It does not have a national data set to pull from, so you have to have that that site-specific real estate appraisal. And then the US Grassland protocol also offers that appraisal as an option where somebody believes that there's actually threat where the default thresholds don't identify one. So for example, there are some counties where there are not enough data in that national data set to actually set a threshold.
And Max, Karen here, did ARB accept the forestry financial additionality process then?
Yeah.
Thank you. May I call on John and Robin? Robin Bloom, if you are comfortable, I know you and John have had several conversations on this as we were developing the protocol, including speaking out to those organizations that are certified under the EcoGift program as certified appraisers. It would be helpful to hear some of the investigations that you, Robin, or John have done. John, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we were basically looking into the EcoGift program as kind of like a verification of those land appraisals to ensure that they've been done to the right kind of standard. It kind of seems like the EcoGift program provides that kind of level of assurance on the land appraisals being done to a certain standard that, you know, CRA have to ensure that they're done to. I think there was some research being done. I forget which university it was at, but Robin, you probably will be able to help me out on that. But there's some research being done on whether we could maybe get something close to kind of the data sets that the US have developed for that they use in their Grassland protocol. I'm not sure where we're at with that one. But yeah, and then the other you know, potential concern with the EcoGift program is whether that program has or the board that reviews those land appraisals in that program, whether they have enough capacity to deal with land appraisals through this protocol too. And we haven't got any conclusions on that, but we will be exploring it hopefully as we sort of roll out and test this protocol. I'll hand over to Robin if he has anything to add.
I see Robin's online, but he's still on mute. He may have had to step away from his desk, but that's definitely, you know, as we're working on sort of implementation issues, this is something we're going to be exploring further. You know, John, what was the average cost of a land appraisal?
Looking at ways to streamline those land appraisals, but the cost we're looking at is maybe 5,000 to 8,000 per appraisal, something in that region, and that would be, you know, streamlining somewhat. So yeah, it's a significant project development cost. So it's but it's also, you know, a significant part of the protocol to ensure that a project is additional. So yeah, any way we can try and streamline that is obviously great, but we also need to ensure that it meets all the additionality criteria. Yeah,
it's not like you're just, you know, having your local realtor come out and do an appraisal. These people are trained and they're certified under the program, and then it's peer reviewed by a panel with adjustments made if they feel that it wasn't done properly. So we're trying to find the rigorous approach to this.
Luckily, it only happens once for the project.
Max, I have a question actually about land appraisals in the US protocol. I don't know if you have any examples of them being done, but do they have to go through a similar kind of verification process?
So, no, I think it was great to see in Canada, there appeared to be more infrastructure around this land appraisal process for conservation. The only example I know of in the US was the first Ducks Unlimited project through the American Carbon Registry. So the history of this is that the reserve developed a forest avoided conversion protocol, and then a group of developers sort of adapted that into a avoided grassland conversion protocol for ACR, and then that got adapted into the avoided grassland conversion protocol in the US for the reserve, which then was adapted into the Canadian version. So the Canada grassland protocol is sort of 4.0 on some of these ideas. But my understanding is that, so Ducks Unlimited was doing a grouped project with about 100 different properties, I believe, in North Dakota or in Minnesota, that area. And I believe it was pretty expensive, and the result of the appraisal was lower than they had anticipated. And that protocol had a binary like 50% discount for that cropland premium. So they ended up getting 50% of the credit volume that they had expected based on the outcome of the appraisal.
Any other questions for Max?